Thank you, Ted, and thank you to the South Dakota State Historical Society. It's very much a really good pleasure and honor to be here with you guys this morning. Hopefully, you guys can all hear me okay back there, right? All right. Well, good morning to you all as well. It's always fun for me to return to appear. I do live in Kyle, South Dakota, so it's a little travel, but I've been through this state many, many times. I see myself as a very appreciative resident and resident that's part of this landscape that goes beyond my 40 years of life. You know, my roots in this landscape, this homeland, have been here for generations upon generations, as kind of expressed in my tribal identity of being Oglala Lakota. And so I'm definitely here to be an individual this morning and to share some insight, context, and celebration of this great master that we also see as another South Dakota son, Oscar Howe, especially as I relate to him as a creative and artist myself. This is a relationship that really transcends bloodlines. It's really something that is profound and transcendent in a way to me. So to be here to speak to Oscar Howe and to speak on behalf of his legacy is something that's very, moving for me as well too. And so I'm definitely happy again to be here with you all this morning. And I'm also very thankful for your generosities in being here as well too, and giving up some of your morning on this beautiful Saturday, this nice spring day that we're experiencing. To share this moment of listening to what Oscar Howe's life was about, but also what was his intentions as this creative, especially as he really held the state dear to his heart. And I know that he's seen this landscape as a state of South Dakota, but he understood as well too that he was still a part of this landscape beyond the boundaries that we consider it as a state. And so I'm definitely again here to speak to my experiences of being attached to his legacy through the Oscar Howe Summer Art Institute, which for those who might not be aware, it's like a 2-week art camp at the University of South Dakota. And so I was very fortunate to encounter that in my time of youth, whenever it was a really important time to start to kind of realize what path may lay ahead of me. What was the next step after high school graduation for a young 18-year-old? I was very not aware of any possibilities for what could be in the future until I had encountered Oscar Howe's work. And so it was a very pivotal moment in my personal life and my journey. And to be here this morning in front of you all as well is another part of that really glorious journey. So we'll start. I have a lot of visuals, and I hope that you guys can see. I don't know if it might be preferred to dim the lights some if you want to see the screens a little bit better. But there's a lot of aid in this lecture. It is also, in a way, more of a presentation, but I think the format is going to sound more like a lecture. I will save some time for questions at the end, or even comments if there's any real good urgency to share your guys' voice in relation to Oscar Howe. Okay? Okay, sorry about that. Maybe I'll switch to the hand mic. It was there, but I'll just scoot up closer. Okay. Okay, let's begin. As you can see, we have a hand of an artist, a really, really beautiful photograph, and it's going to start to introduce us to this journey that is actually an artistic continuum. That is how Oscar Howe saw himself as part of this continuum, and that he had acknowledgement that what he did in his time, his mastery as a visual artist, was also an inheritance that came from his ancestors, his grandfathers, his grandmothers, and beyond as well too. And so as the introduction shared, a lot of how I came to understand some of this history and some of this knowledge, it was in part because of my place as a student at the Oscar Howe Summer Art Institute. Eventually, I also took the positions of staff member, which included. Can you guys hear me Better? All right. That way I don't have to scoot over, hunch over. But that's, like I was mentioning, as the Oscar Howe Summer Art Institute student, eventually I rose in the ranks to become an instructor. I was able to share my instruction of painting, drawing, some of the fundamentals of two-dimensional art. But then I also eventually took the positions of coordinator and assistant director. And so I also must make mention some of the people that were supportive in that opportunity for me. And some of that research that I share with you guys today was credited to Dean John Day at the University of South Dakota, who was very much a big supporter of Oscar Howe and a friend of Oscar Howe, but also in my young career was a friend to me as well too. So I know that it's very important to cite our resources. And I also wanted to make sure that John Day gets his acknowledgement because he did a lot of work in his time at USD, but also across our state and our region to support not only Oscar Howe, but a lot of contemporary Northern Plains tribal artists. And so you'll hear some of that as well in this lecture. But I also ask all of you, who's from South Dakota? This is your homeland. This is where you were born and raised. So if you raise your hand, then even if you didn't, you're a resident, you're a relative in this state with us. I want you to feel that this perspective that I'm going to really stress of being a relative, it's a way of feeling welcoming, a way of feeling inclusive. We want everybody to know that we can see beyond certain barriers. We can see beyond certain nonverbal communication cues that sometimes keep us distant. And that we want to welcome everybody to understand that the arts can be the vehicle to helping us be enriched as all South Dakotans. And so I feel like all of us are also due that we need to give Oscar Howe his celebration, his tribute, his honor. And there's a lot of exciting activities and events that are lined up that are going to happen this year that I'll also be promoting towards the end of this lecture for those that might not yet be familiar with this exciting new exhibition, this large retrospective that's coming to South Dakota that features Oscar Howe's work. But again, I think we all owe him a deep gratitude, respect, and love. So I'd like to begin first with a quote that Oscar Howe had really passionately written, and I think it also exemplifies his philosophy and how he really saw his art. He was always very, very stoic in a beautiful way, that he remained humble to know that his art was only an extension of his Dakota identity, and that anything he did, whether it was creative or not, was just a lifestyle. It was a practice of his Dakota life. And so he's very well today known for his aesthetic quality, as you guys can see in his most popular works of art. There's a certain kind of style that emerges that becomes signature. Most people will see a painting and they'll know immediately it's Oscar Howe's. But I think that, again, he carried this humble nature about himself, that he would recognize that he didn't originate that. Although he was very masterful in coming up with the concept of how he would create this aesthetic, he understood that it went back to his forebears, his ancestors, and a lot of the abstraction that they incorporated into their aesthetic and how they began to express very sophisticated perspectives and concepts of reality and beyond. And so this quote that I'd like to read for you guys in a way sums up some of those concepts that he had, and I think they inform some of his theory on art as well too. So the quote begins, "The Dakota art of painting, its medium, technique, process, subject matter, and its qualitative aspects have given me direction, purpose, substance, and art. An art which is still in its original form, originality, unblemished, and unquestionably a true reflection of culture." He continues, "Being a Dakota with a background of Dakota culture, I felt I should continue the art, to use the ways and means of Dakota art for continuity and still keep the essence of Indian art was paramount in my quest for expression. Its components remain Dakota to the core, regardless of individualization of art." And so you see here one of his really nice paintings that features a figure that also gets into some of his more I believe, preferred subject matter, which were the legends and lore of the Sioux. As I mentioned, I was a young student. I'm also a lifelong resident here of South Dakota. I did venture elsewhere for my education, but growing up, I was not aware of Oscar Howe myself. Of course, I've probably seen some sort of a poster or wall hanging at some point in my young life, but it wasn't until I had graduated high school and actually had a great opportunity through the encouragement of my own high school teachers to go to this Oscar Howe Summer Art Institute in Vermillion. Living in Kyle, South Dakota, which is part of the Pine Ridge Reservation, it's actually like the central location of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. I had never really ventured far outward into South Dakota. I've been to Rapid City, western South Dakota was a little familiar. I had never traveled East River. So I didn't know what to expect. When I arrived in Vermillion, it was a nice shock to just see the nice little community. I really enjoyed just the campus as well. But when I got to the Institute, what was really the eye-opener was going into the Oscar Howe Gallery, which is located in Old Main, and having this Oscar Howe biography shared by John Day. But we had the really great privilege of seeing Oscar Howe's work firsthand. And this was the first painting that I ever seen. And I remember how it instantly drew me in, and I just had to walk right up to it. It was something that it was kind of like so alluring in an unspoken way. I could hear something that drew me there. But when I stood in front of this painting, I also started to recognize really what I believe is spiritual essence, energy in a certain way. And I felt like this artwork was pulsating. It was alive. It was breathing. And it could have been an optical illusion. There was a lot of that possibility within this composition and the technique within. But I think that it was also very much that it was a spiritual energy. And I know that hearing Oscar's philosophy at the beginning of this lecture helps me to know that now today in this later part of my life, that he did place something there for me to discover. And he placed a lot of these possibilities for all viewers of his work to discover on their own terms. And maybe some of you who might be familiar with Oscar Howe and who have really followed his work and you guys have a certain connection to it yourselves can kind of start to picture your own moment that occurred for you as well. But the painting itself features these Sioux women grooming. And this is a good example as well, too, of how the practice of what we call shaicha, how you present yourself into this world, is that you want to present yourself in the best manner possible, even if it's just combing your hair or washing your face or putting on your finest adornment, accoutrements, or even whatever else may be a part of your society, your community, your dwellings, your transportation, your actual objects, utilitarian objects. They had to be their finest all the time. And so I think that this is something that was instilled into Oscar at an early age by his greatest source of support, his grandmother. But I think that it's something that he definitely carried onward throughout his life. But it's also something that was magnificent and that it was lived through him. I think it was an intuition that he would start to understand more in his work. So here's Oscar, a great portrait of the artist at work. Most people might be familiar with some of his likeness at this stage in his life. He was born in 1915, and he had passed away in 1983. So he lived 68 years. That was his longevity of life. And sometimes I think people forget that his life wasn't that long. He actually ended his time here with us at a short age. And we always imagine him as this grand master who might have been immortal. He's lived longer than his 68 years on life. And that does speak to the greatness of his work, that he can still hold that presence in our minds, that we can picture him in that way. His Dakota name was Mazuha Hokshina, which translates to trader boy. And he also carried another name, Itancha, which is leader, and usually symbolized as like being a leader or a chief. And so I think he really did carry that name that he was given with a lot of authority as well. He is part of this confederacy that we call the Ochete Shakoi. Most people refer to this confederacy as the Sioux Nation, the Great Sioux Nation sometimes. But internally, it's also really much an empowerment nowadays to correctly call that Ochete Shakoi, which stands for the 7 council fires. and it makes up these different tribal nations that emerged throughout a temporal order of how they, in a way I always explain this as like, you had your parents first, and then they had a baby, and then the baby grows up and wants to move out of their home, so they go and establish their own location. So that's how these campfires were established, originally extending from Minnesota territory with the first Dakota nations, and then eventually going into the seventh council fire, which would have been the Tetuan people way out west, where I represent. But Oscar Howe himself was from the band that's known as or the Oyate, the nation that's known as the Uhunktuwana. And these are kind of mixed, different tribal members because of a lot of the different kind of location changes. People were moving around, sometimes forcibly, but they, in a way, mixed up. But he's mostly kind of recognized today as being Yanktonai Dakota, is what most people will say. But I think he also carried a lot of different bloodlines. And the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota terms are just for the languages that were mainly spoken. But they have been recognized as being that tribal identity more so today. He's from the community or the location of Crow Creek. It was actually an older area known as Joe Creek, which I believe was covered in the flood. And so it was a very, very small, and I'm pretty sure just only his immediate family members who were really the residents of that location. His great-grandfathers were Itrancha. They were leaders of their nations and their families, their sub-bands of families. And his great-grandfathers' names were White Bear, Matoska, and Bone Necklace. And here's a photograph of his grandfathers. So you can see the prestige that they carry, again, in that presence, that way that you demonstrate who you are and how you're viewed as a person publicly, but also how you carry that esteem of being recognized by your relatives. Similar to the woman or Sioux women grooming, there's a pride and a responsibility to this appearance. These art forms that we see in regalia, adornment, many of them were mostly created by our female relatives. A lot of these mothers, grandmothers, aunties, nieces, sisters, they were the creators. They were the artists who were responsible for the vision and ultimately the understanding of color scheme, design, and expression. And so they were masters in their own right. And so I think that Oscar Howe would eventually understand that he had to always give that respect back to those feminine figures that really were the, I guess, origin of creation itself within these Dakota concepts of art. And it goes further as well, too, within some of the legends that Oscar Howe would understand. He would, recognize certain deities, sacred deities, that were also familiar with creation itself. Some of these deities are understood as the double-faced woman, but I always like to remind men, especially Ochete Shakoi men, that we're only our greatest because of our female relatives. It took all that care to do this. It took a lot of love, compassion, humility to be able to make something with purpose like this. And so here's another example of some of these historical artifacts that might be called today, but really we can also redefine that as works of art, masterful works of art, abstract works of art. And pay attention to, again, the color schemes, the design, some of the patterning. Some of this is going to become evident in Oscar Howe's work when you start to give closer attention, when you make time for that nonverbal communication, that visual communication to occur. But one of the key components to creation itself was kinship. Kinship, family. There's a concept called wotakuye. That's the actual term in Lakota and Dakota language, but it means relationships, enforcing healthy relationships. And this can extend beyond human to human, family member to family member, and go forth within the Oyate, the nation itself, or even beyond nations. It can go into just humanities, human to human, and also metaphysical. It can have a relationship with the world and the galaxy at large as well too. But I always like to discuss the abstractions, the elevated abstractions that you might see in those moccasins or even in these parfleche cases. At a simple glance, they look like shapes and colors, right? But beyond that, they had meaning. And most of the time, these meanings were understood at a very young age throughout adulthood into the very later years of life, that you could remember what that sign, that graphic stood for. It could have been a map of geography, a reminder of how do we migrate through these great lands throughout this Ochete-Shakowee territory, South Dakota landscape, and also know where to be within these certain unpredictable season changes, right? How can we be reminded of how we stay related to the land and all of the relatives that we encounter within those journeys throughout the landscape itself? But I also think that these are forms of optical art, especially the one on the left. And you'll see these attempts to utilize line in a certain manner that creates this illusion that this is warping its actual flat plane. And I think that that's a genius thought. And so whoever was the maker of this, it's an artist known at some time, was practicing advanced theory within art, something that would later become a movement starting in England with the optical art movement. But there's an intergenerational greatness, and this is something I always have to praise, is that we have so much that's within our DNA that can be unlocked. And Oscar Howe was definitely one of the first to open up that door and unlock it for many others to see, like, there is something great within the people of the Ochete-Shakowee. And most of the time, there's an emphasis, especially in today's climate, of historical traumas. And there's a lot of efforts to look at what are the issues, the wrongs, and maybe even call out, reasons for that. But I think that there's also another duality in looking at the historical greatness. How could art, creativity, and just this notion of being a good relative help somebody prosper and enrich themselves even further and get beyond feeling oppressed to the point where there is no productivity at all? So Howe definitely encouraged his students to discover those ancestral powers within themselves as well too. And we're going to talk about Oscar Howe towards the end of this lecture, but I wanted to point out that these are the beginnings. These are what he gained from his development, even indirectly, where he was just given this. It was gifted into his being, but eventually he would really be able to observe this and analyze it more, and then make a good use of it so that he could pass it on to his students, truly making it a continuum. I'm showing a few examples for those just because I think when we talk about Oscar Howe and how he changed what the continuum of native art could be, not only for the Northern Plains region, but for the nation itself, for the entire Indian Territory is sometimes referred to, that it's good to see examples of what was prior to him. And these were also remarkable moments in themselves as well too. And I know that most of you who might be a part of the Historical Society sometimes come across images like this and maybe find some sort of curiosity of your own to look deeper. And so today I'm sharing with you just some of the insight that I've gathered from other artists and other culture bearers and how they've articulated what the meanings of these artworks are about. So this is a very significant art form itself to our region, to our peoples, our indigenous peoples here in the Northern Plains in South Dakota, the winter count. And this is one example of the High Dog winter count, which comes from up north by Standing Rock territory. And it was simply a calendar. It just was documenting what was happening across time, not with only each day, but each year. And this extended over 100 years. And you see that these usually go in a circular type of movement, although it's more of a cubic kind of square looking format. They were meant to be read as a spiral. And these are very glorious forms of, again, elevated thought. And that each of these little icons, these glyphs, were like, you click on that. If you were on your computer, And then you would get a plethora of information. All this context, all this history would emerge through that one glyph. And so I got to give credit to one of my good friends, another artist named John Gozencenter, who also we've had many discussions, and I like to share his thoughts on how he's articulated this. But also other great scholars like Dr. Craig Howe, who we've had lengthy discussions over the winter count. And one of the really interesting facts that we've always discussed is that the first ever image that's recorded for these people in their time usually occurs right at the very, very top on the left side. If you look way up there in the top, and now they're marked with numbers so people could know exactly. But usually that first recording, that drawing, is a very monumental ceremony to the Sioux people. And it's usually something that people overlook. And so some might be familiar with the ceremonies that the people go through. But this is one that sometimes maybe not a lot of people are aware of. And it's the simple making of relatives. They call it the hunka ceremony. And so, again, relative is very important. And it's so that in a lot of these winter counts, it's always the first recording. Being a relative was needed to be understood. And then eventually there's more information that takes place with the change of time. A lot of our histories were not documented in this written or even pictorial format. A lot of them were passed through verbal, oral traditions, the storytellings. This is how a lot of the knowledge was retained in the mind of the great storytellers, the creatives who could memorize these ancient ancestral knowledge, but also shape them in a way that they become creative and entertaining to the listener, where they want to pick that up and make sure that they can remember and continue to tell it their way in the future. So Oscar Howe was introduced to this oral tradition through his grandmother, Shellface. And at a very, very young age, in a time that was probably very meaningful to him and that he needed that support, he heard these great oral traditions. And that is what informed his work. And you will see that continue on throughout his lifetime. But to give some historical context, as people start to think about, well, what was occurring for the Native peoples? What was facing? What were the Native peoples facing within this landscape now of what's considered the U.S.? 1851, we'll start there first, was the first Fort Laramie Treaty between the U.S. and the Sioux, also the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, and let me scoot back. And the Arikara nations. Indian territories, the Oregon Trail, forts and roads into their territories. These things were emerging in that time of 1851. So that would occur probably somewhere into the middle of this. And so some of these images start to kind of resemble some of that context that's taking place. 1862, there's the Dakota War, the Sioux Uprising, it's sometimes as well called, between the Isanti, Santis, Dakota, and the U.S. Great conflict that took place in Minnesota, and it had a really, large impact, drastic impact as well too, with what would occur for our Dakota relatives, also those that were very much connected to Oscar Howe himself, which resulted in the mass execution of 38 Dakota men at Mankato, Minnesota. As we move on, I want to show another pictorial. This is a lot more representational art, but this is also a very famous artist right here. Some of you might be able to read the signature. Sitting Bull, the great leader of the Hunkpapa people from up north in Standing Rock area. Sitting Bull was as a leader, very stoic image, right? Most people have seen the face of Sitting Bull with the large feather that sits atop of his head. How many knew he was an artist? Some of you maybe? All right. Well, after today, some of you know now. And I definitely say artist in a Eurocentric sense, that he took ownership over his art because he signed it at the very, very top. When he was traveling overseas, somebody taught him how to sign his name, and he wrote it in nice cursive as well too. And I think that's one of the first examples of actually seeing a true ownership in that legibility of saying this artist's name is a part of this artwork. There were other accounts as well too of like more pictorial. There were images of how they would say their name through imagery, but I think with the signature itself really sets that standard that here is our first maybe Lakota artist. I really have that theory that I believe that he is the first Lakota artist. And so again, these leaders, these ichancha, these are the qualities that would be passed through that intergenerational greatness. And so a little bit more information about Sitting Bull's drawing itself. I think it's just a courting scene. He's probably looking back to this time in his youth when he remembered this very attractive female that he wanted to woo. So he was singing the song towards her, and she must have loved it. But one of the also other things I like to always talk about is just, again, seeing the power of the brain. Sitting Bull wasn't observing a still life in front of him. He wasn't doing life drawing. He wasn't looking at this horse in front of him, but he was thinking back decades into his memory to remember all that detail of how that surface quality of his horse looked. He remembered all the detail like that over decades. And so that's incredible. That's incredible to think about the outlet of drawing. And this also came at a very important time that could have been really a different outlet for some of these men who were being imprisoned, because there was a great change now taking place when we start to think about more of the historical context. 1868 was the second Fort Laramie Treaty to bring peace between the whites and the Sioux, is how it's referred to, and an agreement to settle with the Black Hills out in western South Dakota. As long as there is a buffalo hunt large enough to justify a hunt was a main point in that treaty, the Article 15, I believe. And so things were rapidly changing for the people. They were no longer having the freedom that they were once familiar with. They were now being more and more kind of confined to certain locations, smaller locations. And for some men, they didn't want to give that up, so they became hostile. They fought against it as much as they could. Others, they accepted that. They knew that there was a change that was coming into the time itself, and they had to find a way to adjust to that change and also accept that change. And so some were, again, imprisoned. Some were forced to be shackled. And I think in that moment of despair, being depressed to the point where you don't have your freedom anymore, what can you do? Right? And there's a whole different route that you could take, maybe. And others turn to creativity. And it was really also through the great generosity of some of the soldiers and some of the other relatives that we can now call them too, that were making their way from the east, who were providing these men mainly with these new media, pencils and paper, something that simple that we can see it as today, but in its time was remarkable and started this great standard again. Now today, ledger art, as we were looking at right here, is priceless, especially if you have one by Sitting Bull. I mean, imagine that, having that. And today, ledger art still continues to thrive. There's a great movement for that as well, too. And there's great ledger artists, even some of Oscar Howe's students as well, who are ledger artist masters, such as Don Montelo. So let's pick up a little bit more context. 1872 to 1890, slaughter to near extinction of 30 million buffalo. We called the buffalo Pteoyate, the buffalo nation. Even that word Pte was a reference to the female gender of the buffalo, the female species of how we saw this historical buffalo as being part of our identity as well too. 1876, Pejishla Wakpa, battle at Greasy Grass River, also known as the Little Bighorn, which was very, very popular. Most people believe a lot of the times when we start talking about Sioux history that's where it all began, was at the Battle of Little Bighorn. There's a lot of information that goes way beyond that as well too, and I know a lot of artists always want to emphasize that, yeah, we have to look beyond that time itself. It's important, but there's a lot that occurred before that as well. 1877, one of our great leaders, Crazy Horse, was killed. 1890, the great artist that you see here, 14 days later, or I'm sorry, Sitting Bull, he was also killed. 14 days later, after his death, then we have another significant moment in history, 1890, Wounded Knee Massacre out in my homeland of Pine Ridge. I always travel by that every week when I'm going to teach my classes. I still see the memorial. And here's an image that Oscar Howe painted as well in reference to what occurred through that moment in U.S. history, South Dakota history, Ochete Shakowee history. It's all a shared history, right? And this is a very large artwork that Oscar Howe created at a time in life when he was really having a great career professionally. He was selling work, he was gaining celebrity as well too, but he took a little bit of a stance in wanting to get more into this historical accuracy, maybe omitted history as well too, and wanting to tell his side of that story, that narrative. And I think it was something that was personal for him at the moment when he created it, but it made a big presence nationally. And it's partly through his wife. The story goes that he was on this television show. Some of you may recall This Is Your Life in the 1960s. And as a guest of that show, that was just a big moment itself to have Oscar Howe, this native person from South Dakota, on that show. But the producers of the show wanted to show their support back to Oscar, and they wanted to purchase an artwork from him. And so I think that he probably would have been more content with passing off something that's more market driven, more like nicer maybe. But his wife said, no, you guys need to purchase this one. And so she was, in a way, his agent as well too, and she forced them to purchase it. And then ultimately what resulted was it was then gifted to the president of the time, Dwight Eisenhower. So that's a huge statement right there, right? To take this moment of U.S. history and take it all the way up to the commander-in-chief, you know. And so again, Oscar Howe, think about that, how impressive that is. This artist that came from our homelands here in South Dakota was able to create that kind of dialogue all the way up to a national level. Today it's at the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum in Abilene, Kansas, I believe. It's really hard to get access to that painting. From what I hear, I don't think many people have actually seen the original. There's a lot of reproductions out there, but I think that it would be great to see that return, especially back to South Dakota. You know, I think that it would be important for us to celebrate its homecoming in a way as well too. Hopefully we can see that in my lifetime. I want to get back to Oscar's biography and share again some of these very pivotal figures that really had an impact on his life in certain ways. You know, none of them were more powerful than the other, but they all had an impact in Oscar's life as a creative. Starts with his paternal grandfather, Umpeshni. They say that translates to don't know how. So that's where the name Howe came from. It was originally don't know how, and they cut the don't know, and they just have the how, and they added the E to it. His maternal grandfather was not afraid of bear. His maternal grandmother was Shellface. This is not Shellface right here. This is a photograph that I had found of a Yanktonai Dakota girl, but I thought there was a really striking resemblance to Oscar Howe's features himself. And I thought, I wonder if there could be some sort of relationship there. But his grandmother, Shellface, was probably the most primary figure in his life. She really helped raise him at that most important time of his youth, when he was kind of without his own parents. I know his mother had passed away early, and his father, I think, was a little bit more removed, but also discouraging to Oscar Howe, especially when Oscar Howe started to demonstrate his artistic urgencies, wanting to draw. And there's a lot of these stoic stories of how Oscar Howe's dad would go and take his charcoal away, or his coal or ashes from the wood stove. He'd take it away and break it and discourage him not to draw. And so Oscar Howe took that and with fortitude kind of continued on saying that I want to be an artist. I'm going to be an artist. So his mother and father, even though they have their points in their story, and we all have our own parents, right? Maybe our own parents have had moments where they were a little discouraging to us and what we were really interested in or excited about at a certain time. But Alla Fearless Bear and George T. Howe, they're also still important to mention because those are his parents. And then eventually also Oscar would start his own family with his wife Heidi and his daughter Inga Dawn, which you'll see a little bit more of when we move through these slides. Okay, so as we transition now, and I've mentioned that Oscar's life at a young age was a little difficult. It was actually extremely difficult. He had a severe skin I don't think it was really a disease, but it was a really harsh condition that was facing his skin, and it caused him to be in a way um, isolated. He didn't have a lot of acceptance. You know how young children can sometimes be, right? They'll tell the truth and they'll say this is how you look and whatnot. So I think that that kept him removed from socializing, and he was in a way only comforted by his grandmother, Shallface. And so I think that that's really where he understood that what he had other than his grandmother was his art. And so they say that he really began showing his artistic quality at age 4, but it wasn't really until maybe age 7 when he started to harness that a little bit more. But at age 7, it's also important to note that this is 1922. He was sent to the Pierre Indian School here in Pierre. It was a boarding school, and he'd stay there for a few years until 1925. And from 7 to 10 years old, he was here at this boarding school. And that's another important moment in history as well, too, for the Native peoples. Like, what was the impact of the boarding school era? There was harsh conditions and a lot of experiences that sometimes are difficult to share and to speak upon. And I definitely also respectfully don't want to overstep myself in speaking to these experiences that our grandfathers and grandmothers had without knowing exactly myself. But there was a time when he was removed from the Pierre Indian School, and he would be spending that time all with his grandmother, and she actually took care of him really well. And they say he got some soap and he would wash himself every day, and eventually his skin cleared up. He did good for himself, and that he recovered from that condition. And he returned to Pierre Indian School in 1926, and then he graduated in 1933. Here's the old Pierre Indian School. They used to call it the industrial school as well too. And so here's some of the ages of Oscar. So he was there from 7 to 10 years old. This is a little guy. And then he came back again, 8 to 18. He spent 10 years there. And he graduated when he was 18-year-old, just like me. Like I shared my story. When I graduated high school at 18 years old, I could only imagine, though, what Oscar Howe's life was like, because 1930s were a drastic time in the U.S. history, right? A lot of things happening. So we'll kind of rewind a little bit more with some historical context. 1904, land allotment in South Dakota. 1924, Indian Citizenship Act through President Calvin Coolidge in response to natives who served in World War I, which was a great thing. Natives were now considered American citizens because of their dedication and their service to this country. 1927, the Vermillion Report, the problem with Indian administration. The federal government is failing Native Americans. It was a really crucial kind of report. I think that also set up things that would follow into this nice time when Oscar's now getting ready to end his schooling, the 1930s. But it really wasn't a great time, right? We use that word Great Depression, though. So people are familiar. And I think today's era, a lot of like young students that I work with, sometimes they don't really even understand what took place in that time. And it's hard for them to imagine what it was like to live. And there's images that are out there, but I think it still just goes over a lot of their head. And I think that it's important for history to be shared in classes so that they can understand, the privileges, the luxuries that are in existence today, and how those can be gained with appreciation as well too. 1933, FDR elected as president, and in 1934, Indian New Deal. 1935, the Indian Arts and Crafts Board was established to promote the economic welfare of Indians through the development of Indian arts and crafts and the expansion of the market for the products of Indian art and craftsmanship. So Oscar Howe's now getting right into this great moment where he's going to be able to experience a lot of these wonderful things that are kind of starting to emerge for Native artists at large. 1935, at the age of 20, Oscar was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And so another hardship, just got over one hardship, now he has another one. But with that brought an opportunity. It allowed him to venture down to the Southwest region into this newly formed school, this newly formed arts school known as the Santa Fe Indian School, but also considered or called the studio through the development of Dorothy Dunn, founded in 1932. This is a very important school as well too, as it has a long legacy down in the Southwest region of producing phenomenal, great Native American artists. But Oscar Howe made his way down there, and you can see him in this photograph. He's the tallest one, or kind of one of the tallest one. I'd like to think that those guys on the back are definitely standing on something. Um, but on the very first left side, you can see Oscar Howe's a tall Dakota man. And a lot of these students were from all over the nation, but primarily the Southwest region. They were a little bit shorter in their stature. But there were some great artists who came from this class with him. Especially, I can only highlight one right now, Alan Hauser, who is kind of right here, third in this bottom row, who was the grandfather of modern Native sculpture. So just incredible to think that Oscar and Alan Hauser were both in that class together. But these artists who were at the Santa Fe Indian School, they would learn this technique and this kind of style that would be called Indian art. It was definitely defined as Indian art, very flat, inspired by the Kiowa artist out of Oklahoma. The Kiowa Six, sometimes only considered the Kiowa Five, but really there were 6 of them. It's also known as the studio style, or also some people say Bambi art, because it reflected the Disney cartoon Bambi very heavily. But you can see Oscar's first attempts at getting a little bit more of this formal education, a little bit more discipline within the arts, and practicing his techniques, still kind of a little bit confined, but finding his voice through the subject matter and the way that he's portraying these dancers in his work. Oscar graduated from the studio in 1938 with honors, and then would immediately return back to Pierre. He would be the art instructor at the Pierre Indian School in 1939 at age 24. And guess how much he made? Any guesses? That's a very generous guess. His pay was room and board. But he was there definitely, I think, thankful, and to get that first gig out of school, to be able to find a way to start really practicing what he's been acquiring in his study. At age 25, 1940, Howe was assigned to the South Dakota Works Progress Administration Artist Project, WPA, for those who might be familiar with that. And through that program, he was able to start gaining some of these commissions, these opportunities to do murals, paint larger within these interiors of some of our architectures. Some of his more notable murals include those that are in Mobridge, which I had just a good couple of conversations about this morning about how they're going to work to get these as registered National Historic Landmarks. So that's very, very exciting and great to hear today. You know, there's a meaning for being here today to hear that. But here's an example of one of the images that's up there in Mobridge. If nobody's yet made it up there to see those, you guys should all make an effort to try to see them in your lifetime. He created these different type of paintings, these murals, and there's 2 kind of themes. One of them's history along the Missouri River, and then the other's the ceremonies of the Sioux. So this one's from the ceremonies of the Sioux, where you see the courtship and marriage ceremony. But a week into that project, while he was working on those murals, he received notice that he was to report to military duty, and he was given a 12-day furlough to complete these murals before he had to get sent to active duty, which was World War II. And so Oscar was also a veteran, and he served 3.5 years in the U.S. Army from his age 25 to 28. So here's young Oscar when he was in the service. He traveled to North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. While in Germany, he met his wife, Heidi. Adelheid Hampel is her full name, but most people just refer to as Heidi. They were engaged in 1945 when he was 30 years old, and they had a good long-distance relationship. I mean, imagine what it's like to have that type of a long-distance relationship. You know, it's unthinkable, probably today's standards, but they made it work. He eventually came back himself to the States, and then later he would send for her. Here's a piece that he did upon returning back to the States after his time in the service. He started to continue on that illustrative kind of aesthetic that was known as the studio style. And this one is actually commissioned by the South Dakota Historical Society, Out Game. Hope you guys still have it over there somewhere. I would love to see it. Um, Here's another similar type of work that he did. This one he did when he was 32 years old, 1947, and he won grand prize in the second annual National Indian Painting Competition at the Philbrook Art Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He won $350 for that prize, and with that money, he used it to send for Heidi so that she can come to the United States. And when she made it here, they were married in Chicago in July 1947. After they were married, Oscar and Heidi moved to Norman, Oklahoma, where he was given this opportunity to illustrate these 2 volumes of North American Indian costumes. And so you'll see all these different tribal nations that were represented in those 2 volumes, as how Oscar would create these nice figurative type of portraits. But with that time, he was also getting more familiar with the University of Oklahoma. Um, there's a lot that's kind of taking place now in Oscar's life in his early 30s. He's really gaining a lot of good opportunities, especially here at home. And from 1948 to 1974, but really it started at age 33, when Oscar was 33, he was given his first opportunity to create these murals for the Corn Palace, the famous Corn Palace. Everybody loves the Corn Palace, right? um, but yeah, he created these great designs that eventually would adorn the Corn Palace and become these beautiful, really unique murals. I do say that with all appreciation and respect. The Corn Palace is awesome. But he would be a part of that for many years. I think he really loved it. I think he had a love for the Corn Palace. Inga Dawn, his daughter, was born in 1948, that same year. So a lot of things are happening in Oscar's life. He's juggling all these great opportunities, this excitement of just getting his work further out there. But now he has a baby, his only daughter, and they moved back to Oklahoma. And with his GI Bill, that kind of supported him as he wanted to return back to higher education. So he first attended Dakota Wiseland up in Mitchell, where he got his bachelor's degree in 1952. While he was there, he was also the artist in resident, and his senior year as a student, he was the head of the department of art there as well too. So this is all very, very impressive, just to think about how this artist was gaining these great professional developments. He was offered a teaching position at Mitchell as well too, but he chose instead to pursue his Master's of Fine Arts, his MFA, at the University of Oklahoma, OU. So he made it back to OU in 1952 to 1954 when he was 37 years old, is when he returned back to his studies. You can see him as a student, as a scholar, but also now he's trying out these different techniques. He's exploring different ways of making his art. He's getting away from some of his more normal methods of the Indian style that he was really using heavily. While he was a graduate student, this is where he had his transcendent moment. The epiphany hit him of like how he could imagine art. And so his now known signature style occurred while he was a master's student. And here's a piece from his thesis, which really shows that style as it began in 1953. Okay, this is a Native American modernism. This is definitely what opened up the door for many to follow, including myself. But he always held his ground to say that he was inspired not only by movements and European art lineage. Most people will always compare his work to Cubism or even Orphism. But I think that he understood that those were in existence. And I'm sure he's seen these different movements while he was studying art as a graduate student. But he always held his ground that he believed that these were based in what's called the Tohoku painting style. That's how he got his aesthetic quality of what is known as composition, the aesthetic points that really hold his work. And it's Tohoku is a spider's web. So it goes back to his Dakota philosophy of seeing in nature the perfect compositions. Very similar to how other great masters, especially the Renaissance masters, would also start to think about Gestalt theory. How could there be points to a composition that hold it all together as one great work of art? And then the mind of the viewer, the reification of the mind of the viewer would then, put it all together and understand the sensation of the visual of what they're seeing. So Oscar opened up the door following that. He also became a really great instructor of art, arts educator, and those who were his student, by chance, any of you his students in this class? Sometimes I come across them still, and I always think that they're worth celebrating as well too, because they have great stories and great voices to share. But at age 38, 1953, Oscar was named a director of art at the high school here in Pierre until 1957. In 1954, at age 39, he was named artist laureate of the museum in Mitchell. And then he was receiving multiple merit awards throughout this time as well too. But it was this painting here that became really his most famous kind of moment in his career. When he painted this painting here, for a long time it was hard to get the actual image of this, but most recently with his retrospective Dakota Modern that's now traveling, they were able to get a better quality. Some people don't even yet know exactly where this painting is, but this is the painting he entered into the Philbrook art competition in Oklahoma, which was rejected. And so this is the painting that he then sent his famous response letter that opened up this call for action of how are artists defining what their art is about. And so this is all happening in his 40s now, his early 40s. He's starting to get all these opportunities to really push himself further and further along. At 42, he was the assistant professor of art at USD, where he relocated to and pretty much stayed until his later death as well too. For 25 years, he was the professor of art there at USD. But he gained many honors, especially in our state of South Dakota. He was the first South Dakota artist laureate at age 45. At age 58, he was the first South Dakota Governor's Award for distinction and creative achievement. Some of his students would also gain that as well too, Arthur Amiot and Robert Penn. So that's also a really a great thing to think about as well too. I know we're short on time, so I won't read the letter to you all, but I do encourage you guys to look at it because it is out there and it is regarded as really influential in helping a lot of artists to kind of find their own path as well too in today's art world. I do need to, before I end today, highlight Oscar's generosity and how he gave back to these students, especially these students that came from the South Dakota landscape, these tribal homelands, and that he saw his platform, his stature as a really remarkable artist, and that he didn't let his ego take him over or consume him. He needed to give back to these young students who sometimes didn't have these opportunities yet. And so he established the Oscar Howe Summer Art Institute in the 1960s. Here are some of his first students, including Herman Redout. I believe the gentleman on the left side is David Sebring, and then Donald Montello, the young Donald Montello right here, who some people might know because Donald Montello is also a great artist as well too. And so they all picked up Oscar's style, and he was helping them to define that. Here's, you can use my style for starters, but eventually find your own. Other students of Oscar's that are also very notable are Arthur Amiot. There are many other students who have maybe encountered Oscar Howe through like a smaller workshop, not necessarily the institute itself, that include Colleen Cutshall. But his protege, the student that really did kind of, I think, grasp onto Oscar's education and how he was sharing of himself back to help a young artist was Robert Penn. Robert Penn is also a great, remarkable artist of the state of South Dakota too. And so I think that most people, when they start to talk about Oscar Howe, next need to understand about Bobby Penn as well too. But Bobby Penn would carry on the torch of the Oscar Howe Summer Art Institute. So here's some of Bobby Penn's work. And you can see in that photograph that Oscar Howe was really kind of like over his shoulder, and they were exploring like the next step, the evolution in abstraction. And so some of Bobby Penn's early work was pure abstraction, what we might look at as abstract expressionism, which is exciting to think that that was all occurring here in our South Dakota state as well too. So the Oscar Howe Summer Art Institute led on, eventually when Oscar was in control of it, when he was the instructor, the head instructor, it was a short period of time. After that, he did eventually get Parkinson's disease, and it affected his career. So you see his work slow down later in the 1970s. So he had the 60s and 70s where he was the most productive with his signature style that most people might be familiar with. But after that, in the 1990s, Bobby Penn took on the Summer Art Institute at USD and continued that legacy on. And since its time, John Day as well got involved in making sure that it stayed alive. And it's lived up to today. So here's one of the more recent photos of some of the students who go to the Oscar Howe Summer Art Institute. And they're all diverse. It's not necessarily only for Native students. It's inclusive to all young artists that are interested in gaining some sort of foundation and path of their own for the arts. And one of the big events that they attended was up in Minnesota, where they were right up there by US Bank Stadium, downtown Minneapolis, and they were doing all these great sculptures and stuff like that. So in closing, I really thank you guys for your generosity of time. In closing, I just want to, again, highlight the remarkable Oscar Howe. It has been my privilege to be here with you all today and to speak on his behalf. As you can tell, there's a lot to say, and that's because I want to say a lot when given that opportunity. I mean, we could go on for a whole symposium on Oscar Howe, but we just don't have that time. So I'm very thankful to the Historical Society for allowing this moment for Oscar Howe. It's really like, we thank you, all of us who are looking at Oscar Howe, and with those really, really big appreciations, that we thank you guys for making that time for him here today. And at the end of his career, he started to venture into this, again, pure abstraction itself. And I think that this was kind of his calling back to where he began, just that inheritance. He probably saw himself preparing for that next step of what would ultimately be, the ending of his time here on Earth. So the last quote that I leave with you is a nice quote that I'll read. In art, I have realized a part of a dream, to present a true image of the Dakota Indian as I understand him and his culture. And then he ultimately died in 1983 at age 68. So I also wanted to make mention, while I'm here, that the large retrospective Dakota Modern is coming to South Dakota, and it's on its way to the South Dakota Art Museum in Brookings. It opens June 10th, and it will close September 17th. And there's a lot of exciting programming that's going to be coming with that as well too. So I hope all of you might make plans to stop by there at some time this summer or into the early fall and see it for yourself. He is one of our South Dakota sons, and again, he deserves that appreciation, that respect, and love. So thank you all. I appreciate your time. Thank you.